It began with a soft rain falling over the small coastal town of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The night of May 14, 2006, had seemed ordinary. The kind of misty evening where lights from the harbour looked like tiny fires floating on dark water. In the quiet of a second-floor apartment near Main Street, a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Whitmore sat by her kitchen table, writing something down. A pen scratched slowly across lined paper. Her radio hummed faintly in the background, a folk station playing songs about home and memory. That letter, folded and tucked into an envelope that night, would vanish along with her. Sarah worked as a part-time art teacher at a nearby elementary school and spent weekends helping her sister at a family-owned bookstore downtown. People described her as calm, generous, and a little shy, someone who could make silence feel comfortable. She'd moved to Gloucester from Cambridge 2 years earlier after breaking off a long relationship, hoping the small-town quiet would bring her peace. Her mother, Diane, said she was finally starting to sound happy again, but that peace didn't last. On May 15, 2006, Sarah didn't show up for work. Her classroom lights stayed off, her car still parked in her apartment's small gravel lot. At first, co-workers thought she might have called in sick, but when the school day ended without a word from her, concern grew. By the next morning, her sister Rachel was standing outside Sarah's apartment, knocking on the door until her knuckles turned red. Inside, everything looked untouched. A mug half full of tea sat cold on the counter. Her phone charger was still plugged in, her shoes by the door. Nothing looked stolen or broken. Only her purse and a small overnight bag were missing. The window by her kitchen sink was open, letting in the damp smell of rain. Police arrived within an hour. Detective Alan Mercer, a veteran of the local department, led the search. He'd handled missing person cases before, but this one felt different. The apartment gave off a kind of stillness that made his stomach tighten. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints that didn't belong, just a faint indentation on the kitchen table where someone had pressed hard with a pen. But the paper itself, whatever she'd been writing, wasn't there. For days, police canvassed the area. Flyers went up around the harbour, on church bulletin boards, and at the small cafe where Sarah liked to sketch during her lunch breaks. Locals joined in search parties, walking along the marshes and through the thick pine woods behind her apartment complex. Boats were sent out to check the coastline. Nothing. Her family appeared on local news pleading for information. "If anyone's seen her, please come forward," Rachel said in a trembling voice, clutching a framed photo of her sister, smiling with paint on her hands. The case drew regional attention. A young teacher gone missing without a trace in a small Massachusetts town. By the second week, investigators started piecing together her last known movements. On the evening of May 14th, a neighbor reported hearing soft music and footsteps above his apartment around 9 p.m. Another resident saw her car still in the lot at midnight. Then nothing. No one saw Sarah leave. No one saw anyone enter. Detective Mercer requested cell tower data, but in 2006 cell phone tracking wasn't precise. Her flip phone pinged once near the harbour around 10 p.m., less than half a mile away, and then went silent. As weeks turned to months, hope began to fade. By late summer, the Whitmore family set up a small vigil at the edge of the harbour. Candles flickered in the sea breeze, reflecting off the water like hundreds of small wavering stars. Diane whispered, "Where are you, sweetheart?" Her voice barely rose above the sound of the waves. In the police files, the case turned from active investigation to unsolved missing person. Mercer hated typing that word. Missing. It sounded temporary, like she might just walk back in one day. 2 years later, a local fisherman found something tangled in seagrass about 4 miles north of town. A handbag, faded and weather-worn, with a driver's license still inside. Sarah's face stared up from behind cracked plastic. Inside the bag were her keys, a small sketchbook, and a folded envelope sealed tight. The paper inside damp and nearly unreadable. The handwriting matched hers. Forensic technicians at the state lab tried to dry and preserve it, but much of the ink had bled. They recovered only partial lines. "If anything happens to me," followed by a few words that couldn't be deciphered. The envelope had no address. It wasn't mailed. Mercer felt that old knot in his stomach tighten again, but with no body, no witness, and no clear suspect, the case eventually went cold. Years passed. Technology changed. Detectives retired. Gloucester kept its quiet rhythm. Tourists in summer, grey silence in winter. The Whitmore family learned to live in a world that didn't have Sarah in it. Her mother still set a plate for her at Thanksgiving, unable to let go of hope. In 2015, nearly a decade later, the State Police Cold Case Unit reopened the file as part of a broader review. Detective Lauren Kearney, a detail-oriented investigator known for her persistence, was assigned to look at Sarah's disappearance. Lauren spent days going through the old evidence, photographs, interview notes, and that fragile water-stained letter. She noticed something odd. The lab report listed the papers out of fold as containing partial fingerprints, but the original analysis marked them inconclusive. The technology back then wasn't advanced enough to get a match. Now, it was. She requested that the evidence be resubmitted to the state lab for reanalysis. A few weeks later, she got a call. The partial print was clear enough this time to generate a hit. A man named Daniel Reeves, who'd once lived in the same apartment complex as Sarah in 2006. Reeves had moved out 2 weeks after her disappearance. At the time, he told police he barely knew her, just exchanged greetings in the hallway. Nothing about him had seemed suspicious. But his name popped up years later in a minor domestic dispute case in New Hampshire. His fingerprints from that case were now in the database. Lauren drove to the old complex and stood by the same cracked pavement where Sarah's car had once been parked. The building looked almost the same. Chipped paint, salt in the air, faint hum of seagulls above. Neighbors had changed, but one elderly tenant remembered the case. "That poor girl," she said, shaking her head. "You could feel something wrong that night. Like the air went heavy." Lauren's next stop was New Hampshire to find Reeves. She found him working at a hardware supply warehouse, living in a rented trailer outside of Portsmouth. When she introduced herself and mentioned Sarah Whitmore, his face went pale for half a second, before he forced a smile. "Yeah, I remember her," he said. "Quiet lady? What's this about after all these years?" Lauren just nodded and handed him her card. "We're reviewing old cases. Sometimes things come up." After that visit, she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. When she got back to her car, she wrote in her notes, "Observe reaction when shown photo." She had purposefully not shown him one, saving that for later. She returned 2 days later, this time carrying a photo of Sarah, the very same picture used on the missing posters in 2006. When she placed it on the table in front of him, he looked at it too long, as if caught between remembering and denying. "You ever talked to her before she disappeared?" Lauren asked quietly. He shrugged. "Not really. Maybe once or twice in the hall." But his voice cracked slightly on the word once later, when she compared his old interview transcript from 2006. She saw that he'd said, "Never spoke to her, just saw her around." The contradiction was small, but small cracks often split cases open. Lauren decided to dig deeper. She obtained a warrant for his old storage unit, which he'd abandoned years ago. Most of the items were junk, rusted tools, old boxes, a few books. But inside one box, wedged between papers, was another envelope. It was blank on the outside, sealed, and discolored by time. Inside was a folded letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Sarah's, the ink faded but legible this time. It read, "Daniel's been following me. I think he broke into my apartment while I was at work. I told him to stop, but he keeps saying he wants to talk. I'm scared he'll hurt me." Lauren froze. The date on the top corner was May 14th, 2006, the same night Sarah disappeared. It wasn't mailed. It wasn't meant for anyone except maybe herself. A confession written to paper when she didn't know who else to tell. The letter changed everything. Lauren's team collected the paper carefully and sent it for analysis. Forensic experts confirmed the handwriting was Sarah's, and on the envelope seal, there were faint traces of skin cells. DNA tests matched them to Daniel Reeves. That discovery set off a chain reaction within the department. Mercer, now retired, was called in for consultation. When he saw the photo of the recovered letter, his eyes filled with tears. "All these years," he whispered. "It was right there." Police obtained a search warrant for Reeves's property in Portsmouth. What they found would soon reveal the truth behind one of Massachusetts' most haunting cold cases. When investigators entered Daniel Reeves's trailer on the morning of September 8, 2019, the air inside was thick with dust and the faint odor of motor oil. A ceiling fan creaked overhead, turning slowly. The living room looked ordinary enough. Worn couch, half-drunk cans of soda, a stack of mechanic manuals by the door. But Lauren's attention was drawn immediately to the far corner, where an old wooden chest sat beneath a window. Inside that chest were fragments of Sarah's life. There were sketches torn from notebooks, a strand of dark hair taped to a small envelope, and a silver earring that Rachel Whitmore later confirmed had belonged to her sister. At the bottom lay a small mold-stained notebook, with a single name written on the first page, Sarah. Lauren flipped through it carefully. Between pages filled with numbers and random notes, one line stood out, written in jagged handwriting that didn't look like Sarah's at all. She didn't listen. Her pulse quickened. That afternoon, detectives sealed off the property and brought Reeves in for questioning. He didn't resist. He sat quietly in the small interrogation room at the Portsmouth State Police outpost, hands folded on the metal table. His eyes darted toward the one-way mirror every few seconds, but he said nothing. Lauren walked in, calm and composed, carrying a file under her arm. "Daniel," she said softly, "you remember me? I told you we were reviewing an old case." He nodded once. "I'm here because of Sarah Whitmore." He exhaled, long and slow, like air leaving a balloon. "I already told you. I didn't know her like that." She opened the file and slid a photo across the table, the letter found in his storage box. "You kept this?" His jaw tightened. "That's not mine." "Your DNA says otherwise," she replied. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes stayed locked on his. "Do you want to tell me how it got there?" He stared at the photo for several seconds, then looked away. "I don't know. Maybe she dropped it. Maybe I picked it up." Lauren leaned forward. "It was sealed, Daniel. The only way your DNA ends up on that seal is if you licked it yourself." He didn't answer. Outside the room, officers watched the recording. One of them murmured, "He's breaking." But Reeves didn't confess, not that day, not that week. His lawyer demanded to see the evidence, and while prosecutors began preparing their case, detectives combed through every inch of his property for something more, something undeniable. A week later, they found it. Behind the trailer, buried just beneath a patch of weeds near an old rusted fence, searchers uncovered a metal box wrapped in plastic. Inside were a set of car keys, a small bracelet with turquoise beads, and a faded Polaroid photo of the harbor. It was the same photo Sarah had taken during a school photography project. Her sister confirmed it immediately. For investigators, that was the missing link tying Reeves directly to her belongings after her disappearance. But there was still no body. Without remains, prosecutors feared they'd have trouble proving murder beyond reasonable doubt. Lauren knew this, and it haunted her. Every night she went home and replayed the case in her head, trying to picture what might have happened on that rainy night in 2006. What she didn't know was that another clue had been hiding in plain sight for years. During her review of archived police files, Lauren noticed an old note about a construction project that took place near Sarah's apartment complex in June 2006, just a month after she vanished. A stretch of road behind the building had been dug up to repair an underground pipe. The construction site was later paved over. Lauren requested ground-penetrating radar for a scan of that area. The city approved the search. On a cool October morning in 2019, she stood with her team beside the narrow alley where the asphalt had cracked from years of New England winters. When the radar images came back, they showed an anomaly roughly 5 feet below the surface, small, irregular, and out of place. The crew began to dig. Within hours they hit something solid. Wrapped in layers of decayed fabric was the outline of a human form. The air went still. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Even seasoned officers looked away. The medical examiner confirmed the remains were female. Inside a pocket of the tattered clothing, they found a small metal locket. When opened, it revealed 2 tiny photos, one of Sarah as a child, the other of her sister Rachel. DNA testing confirmed it. After 13 years, Sarah Whitmore had been found. The news broke across Massachusetts like a storm. Local TV stations ran special segments revisiting the 2006 mystery. Reporters stood by the harbor where her vigil candles once flickered, describing how a hidden letter and new forensic tools had finally cracked the case. For Rachel and Diane, it was both relief and heartbreak. "We always believed she was close," her mother whispered through tears. "I just didn't think she was that close." Reeves was charged with first-degree murder and unlawful disposal of human remains. In the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together the final timeline of events. Sarah's recovered letter had been written the same evening she disappeared, and sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. phone records placed Reeves's cell near her building at 9:12 p.m. Neighbors later remembered hearing a sharp sound, like a heavy object dropped, though no one reported it at the time. Detectives believed that after confronting her that night, Reeves entered her apartment through the unlocked kitchen window. A struggle likely ensued. She may have been trying to mail the letter, planning to deliver it to police the next day. Instead, Reeves stopped her. The location of her body, directly beneath the road behind her apartment, suggested he used the nearby construction site to hide her remains. Investigators determined that during the early morning hours, before the city crews arrived, Reeves buried her and later returned to watch as the road was paved over. The case went to trial in Essex County Superior Court in early 2021. By then, more than 15 years had passed since the night Sarah disappeared. Many of the original investigators were retired, but they returned to testify. Mercer took the stand, his grey hair tucked neatly beneath his hat as he told the jury about the first days of the search, about how he'd stared at that empty apartment, wondering what he'd missed. When Lauren testified, she held up the original letter, sealed now in a protective sleeve, and told the court how it had been found. "She wrote it on the night she was taken," Lauren said quietly. It was her voice trying to warn someone, anyone. That letter spoke for her when she no longer could. Reeves sat expressionless throughout most of the trial. His defense attorney argued there was no physical proof of intent, that the letter only showed fear, not violence. But the prosecution's narrative, built on DNA, fingerprints and the sheer weight of coincidence, was unshakable. Then came the testimony that sealed the case. A forensic analyst from the state lab explained how trace soil samples from the metal box found behind Reeves's trailer matched the soil, composition of the construction site where Sarah's remains were buried. It was a rare mineral blend unique to that patch of land. When the analyst presented the data, one juror glanced at Reeves and shook her head slightly. The defense tried to argue contamination, coincidence, anything that might create doubt. But in the end, it wasn't science that broke him. It was guilt. On the 7th day of testimony, as prosecutors displayed the photo of the recovered letter on the courtroom screen, Reeves lowered his head into his hands. A soft sound escaped his throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a sigh. When the judge called for recess, he whispered to his attorney, then turned to the bench. "I want to tell the truth," he said. The courtroom fell silent. His confession came in fragments, through tears and silence and long pauses. He said he'd become obsessed with Sarah after running into her at the mailboxes one evening. He'd followed her, convinced she was sending him signals. On the night of May 14th, he went to her apartment to talk. When she told him to leave, he panicked. She started yelling, he said quietly. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to stop." He described how he'd buried her behind the complex before sunrise and returned home. He said he kept the letter because it made her feel real, words that left everyone in the room sickened. The judge's gavel struck once, echoing sharply. When the verdict came 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Rachel held her mother's hand as the clerk read, "Guilty on all counts." Diane closed her eyes. The air filled with quiet sobs, muffled by masks. It was the middle of the pandemic year, but grief needed no distance. Lauren stood in the back, feeling the weight of years lift, just slightly. After the sentencing, she visited the harbour alone, the same place where Sarah's vigil had once been. The air smelled of salt and rain. The water reflected the evening light, calm and endless. She placed a small white flower in the tide and whispered, "We found you." Back home, she wrote her final report for the case file. At the bottom, she added one personal note. Never underestimate the power of a letter. Sometimes the smallest voice is the one that carries across years. The story of Sarah Whitmore became a reminder throughout the Massachusetts State Police system of how persistence and a single piece of paper could bring justice to the silenced. In 2022, the department introduced a training module for new recruits based on the Whitmore investigation, teaching how revisiting small overlooked clues could turn dead ends into breakthroughs. Rachel started an art scholarship in her sister's name at the local elementary school where Sarah once taught. Every spring, one student would receive funds to continue art studies, a quiet legacy that kept her name alive in classrooms filled with color and laughter. Diane. Her mother kept the recovered letter framed in her home, not as a symbol of pain, but of strength. "She tried to warn the world," she told a reporter, and in the end, that's what saved her story. As years passed, documentaries revisited the case, drawing national attention. But Lauren stayed out of the spotlight. She declined every interview, saying only that the case speaks for itself. When asked privately what moment she'd never forget, she said it wasn't the arrest or the verdict. It was holding that letter for the first time. The ink had faded, but the fear and courage in those words were still alive. "I think," she said, "it was Sarah's way of reaching through time." The case file was officially closed in 2023, 17 years after the night she vanished. But her story, like the letter that refused to disappear, continues to echo through the quiet streets of Gloucester, reminding everyone who remembers her that justice, though sometimes delayed, still arrives when the right eyes finally see the truth. When the detectives reopened the file, the first thing they did was re-examine the evidence box sealed for nearly 2 decades. Inside were the familiar items, the victim's scarf, her old flip phone, and that letter, now the center of everything. The ink had faded in parts, but its message remained hauntingly clear. Investigators sent it once more to the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, requesting every modern test available. This time, the results stunned everyone. Traces of DNA were detected on the back flap of the envelope and under the edge of the stamp, tiny fragments that earlier technology had missed. The analysts ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database. A match hit almost instantly. The name that appeared on the screen belonged to someone who had never been suspected, someone who had quietly built a life not far from the very street where the victim once lived. His name was Daniel Kershaw, a handyman then in his mid-40s, known in the community for small repair jobs and friendly charm. He had no violent record, only minor misdemeanors. But the match was undeniable. Detectives began building their case carefully. They traced Daniel's movements back to 2006. At that time, he had been working at a hardware store only blocks from the apartment building where the victim lived. Surveillance footage from that year was long gone, but witnesses' memories lingered. A former co-worker recalled Daniel mentioning a woman from his route who owed him a favor. It seemed insignificant then, but now it sounded chilling. When police brought Daniel in for questioning in early 2023, he appeared calm, even polite. He denied knowing the victim at all. Yet as the questioning deepened, small cracks began to show. He paused too long at simple questions. His eyes darted toward the photo of the letter when detectives placed it on the table. "That's not mine," he muttered, but his voice trembled. Investigators already had his DNA on file from an unrelated incident years ago, an old bar fight that led to a brief arrest. The lab confirmed the match again, 100% certainty. The saliva on the envelope belonged to him. Within hours, officers surrounded his modest rental home in Worcester County and took him into custody. The news spread fast. Reporters gathered outside the police station. The headline that had once haunted Massachusetts for years, "Young woman found dead near train tracks," now had a shocking follow-up. People wanted to know how a man who'd lived quietly among them for years could have carried such a secret. Inside the small interview room, Daniel's calm demeanor faded. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he slumped in his chair and stared at the wall for what felt like minutes. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "She found the letter. She wasn't supposed to." Detectives leaned forward, recording every word. He went on, saying that he and the victim had met a few times when he delivered supplies to her building. He said she was too curious, that she found something he had left, a letter written not to her but to someone else, one that mentioned a theft he'd been part of years earlier. When she confronted him about it, things escalated. "She said she'd tell the police," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to—" But he stopped mid-sentence. The room fell silent. Daniel's confession was partial, broken, and evasive, but it was enough. Detectives charged him with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. The old case that once seemed unbreakable had finally cracked wide open because of that single letter, the one she had never meant to find, the one that eventually told the truth. The trial began in the spring of 2024 at the Worcester County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, old neighbors, and family members who had aged decades waiting for this moment. The victim's parents sat together in the front row, hands clasped tightly. They had spent years attending vigils, posting flyers, and meeting with investigators who could never give them answers, until now. The prosecution presented its case methodically. They described how Daniel had lured the victim under the pretense of clearing up a misunderstanding, how he'd panicked when she mentioned the police, and how he left her near the railway path in a desperate attempt to stage a robbery. The DNA on the envelope was the linchpin, evidence from his own breath sealing the truth. Defense attorneys argued there was no intent to kill, calling it a tragic accident. But the jury saw the pattern of lies, the years of silence, the care he'd taken to hide his connection to her. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. When the judge read the sentence, life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 25 years, the courtroom went silent except for a single sob from the victim's mother. She had waited nearly 2 decades to hear someone held accountable for what had happened to her daughter. After the trial, detectives stood outside the courthouse giving brief statements. One of them, Detective Maria Reynolds, who had been fresh out of training in 2006 when the case first broke, said softly to the reporters, "Sometimes the smallest thing holds the loudest truth." In this case, it was a letter. Her words spread across news outlets that evening. The public, long haunted by the mystery, finally saw resolution. Over the following months, true crime programs revisited the story. Podcasts dedicated episodes to how a forgotten envelope had changed everything. It wasn't just a story about murder. It became a story about persistence, technology, and time catching up with truth. The victim's family returned to the small memorial by the old train tracks the following summer. The trees had grown thicker, and the flowers they once left had long withered. They replaced them with fresh lilies, placing them beneath a small plaque that read, "Justice, at last." Her mother touched the plaque gently, whispering something only the wind could carry. In 2025, Massachusetts police introduced a statewide initiative named after the victim, the Hidden Letter Program, aimed at re-examining overlooked evidence in unsolved cases. The initiative encouraged families to come forward with forgotten items, letters, notes, photographs that might hold overlooked forensic potential. Within its first months, the program reopened 3 other cold cases. The victim's story, though heartbreaking, had created change. Daniel Kershaw remains in prison serving his sentence at MCI Norfolk. He has never appealed his conviction. His silence, detectives say, is its own kind of confession. The story of this Massachusetts case reminds us that time doesn't erase truth. It simply waits for the right moment to be heard. A faded envelope, sealed nearly 20 years ago, carried not just words but justice waiting to be found. If you followed this case till now, remember, somewhere out there another family still waits for answers. Another letter, another memory, another forgotten clue might be the key. Don't let it stay buried. And if you want more true stories of justice finally catching up to the past, subscribe because more cases like this one deserve to be